All right, so it's 9 o'clock. We are going to get started. We appreciate you all coming this morning. I always enjoy putting these together when it's my turn to do a Launchpad lecture, but I think I had some special fun with this one. And I think some of you probably will relive some childhood memories. The question is today, has science fiction in its era predicted the future? A lot of claims have been made over many, many years. For example, how many of you say, I'm going to Walmart or Sam's Club just so I can walk down the aisle, hit that beam, and an ad on the end cap will come up and tell me I should buy this product? How many of you go there just for that reason? Anybody ever see Blade Runner? The movie Blade Runner? What was one of the visual things in that film? Ads. Ads everywhere. Ads floating in the sky. Ads wherever they went. And now it's a reality of our life today. Whenever you go to a big box store, you get hit up with an advertisement. That was originally taken from a Philip K. Dick story, and I think the novel was not called Blade Runner. It was called Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Philip K. Dick also wrote Minority Report, which became the movie that came out a few years ago. And that particular story talked about facial recognition. If you keep up with the news, a few years ago, there was a story here locally that a pedophile that police were looking for went through the Border Patrol checkpoint. I don't know, it was 54, I think it was 70. Whenever you go through there, those cameras take a picture of you, and it goes to a facial recognition database. By the time this wanted young man had gone by the camera and come to a stop at the Border Patrol checkpoint, they knew who he was. A period of just a few seconds. And that was discussed by Philip Dick in the 1960s, I believe, in the movie Minority Report. So that's another fact of our life today. 1984, we are living Big Brother. If you haven't read that book, go back and read it again. So it's been said that science fiction doesn't predict as much as it extrapolates. Who comes up with these ideas? It's the writers that come up with these ideas, whether it's a novel, whether you're writing a film. And if it wasn't for the idea, the question is, if a writer had not come up with an idea, would someone look at that idea and create that technology? That's probably an argument you could go back and forth on. So once again, for all intents and purposes, a lot that was talked about in science fiction many decades ago has become our way of life today. So we're going to look at some of those things today. What has become reality? What was predicted has not become reality. So these right here are drawings from the World Exhibition in Paris in 1900. They were created by the French and put in cigar and cigarette boxes. This is what life was going to be like in the year 2000. How many of you have been to an automated barber? That hadn't come true yet. This was in 2000, the way the busy farmer would work. He'd sit in a station on his porch, and he would run everything out in the field by some devices. That has not come true. Where in the world they thought that we would eventually take to seagull fishing is beyond me. But they do, yeah. So seagull fishing, that was going to be a big sport in the year 2000. That has not happened. And the way we would teach our kids, we'd just pour the books into a machine, and it would transmit through wires and go into your brain. I guess you could make, if you're a conspiracy theorist, you could make the argument that that's the way we get our media news today, but I don't know. Some things on those cards have come true. In the year 1900, by 2000, they said we would have planes that would fight we would use as tools to go into battle. And there you see the card from 1900, and here you see some of the technology today that we have in the military. And bombers as well. Look at that. You have the same type of aerodynamic manufacturing there. And of course, the B-2 bomber. Fortunately, it's not a lighter than air aircraft. And in your homes, we would have automatic maids that would clean up and do everything after us. Do we have that today? Yeah, we do. Your wife, is she here? So yeah, to some degree, that technology is coming into our lives today. Can science fiction predict the future? I've divided this into three parts. We'll look at the past first. And by the past, let's look at some of the early things that were done by the writers. We're going to go all the way back to the post-Civil War. This gentleman right here, Hugo Gernsback, who coined the term science fiction in the 1920s, eventually shortened to sci-fi. Hugo Gernsback published a lot of different magazines about electronics, about science fiction, Amazing Stories. The TV show Amazing Stories in the 80s that title came from his magazines, Astounding Stories. And he said, let it be understood in the first place that a science fiction story must be an exposition of a scientific theme, and it must also be a story. So if you're telling a story, the technology that you're inventing in that story has to fit in with the storyline, otherwise it's just a bunch of garble. Brick Moon. This book was actually serialized in the Atlantic Monthly in 1869. Anybody ever read it? I'd like to find a copy. This is the first example in literature, and this was credited by Arthur C. Clarke. Now, Arthur C. Clarke, of course, came up with the idea of geosynchronous satellites for communication. He, in 1963, actually credited this in one of his books, that it was the first example in literature of a satellite used for navigational aids. You see that round ball up in the corner? That's not a moon, that is a navigational satellite. And it's called the Brick Moon. It was written by Edward Everett Hale because they made it out of bricks. How they ever thought they'd get it off the ground. And in the context of the story, from things I've read on the internet, the plot line involves people who go to see the inside of the satellite. It gets launched, they get stuck up there. But in 1869, Edward Everett Hale put the first navigational aid satellite into literature, and our world is run by satellites these days. Is this not a cool picture right here? Jules Verne, From the Earth to the Moon, the Apollo 11 Saturn V rocket, if you look at the similarities there. There were a lot of things that Jules Verne actually talked about in From the Earth to the Moon. It is a novel that was published in 1865. It talks about the Baltimore Gun Club, and they were going to launch men to the moon, and they did in the context of the story, out of a cannon. Now, in the context of the story, they launched them at 22,000 Gs, which would squash you to a pulp. There'd be nothing left. But they did go to the moon, and one of the ironies in the story is they launched from Florida, not far from where Cape Canaveral was actually eventually built. And if you've ever read the novel, it's been many, many years since I read it, there are just eerie similarities to the story to how our moon program actually came into being. How many of you knew that L. Frank Baum, who wrote Wizard of Oz, actually wrote science fiction into his stories? Tick-Tock of Oz was the 8th in his Wizard of Oz series, and in that particular story, and I'm going to find that and read it to you here and see if you can see what he talks about. This was published in 1914, more than 100 years ago. And I quote, he said, Shaggy suspected the truth, believing that Ozma was now taking an interest in the party. He drew from his pocket a tiny instrument, which he placed against his ear. Ozma, observing this action in her magic picture, at once caught up a similar instrument from a table beside her and held it to her own ear. The two instruments recorded the same delicate vibrations of sound and formed a wireless telephone in 1914. Those separated by any distance were thus enabled to converse together with perfect ease and without any wire connection. That was 1914. 5 years later, in this one of Hugo Gernsback magazines, he basically introduced the idea of Skyping in 1919, yeah. Olaf Stapledon, who was a British writer, put cell phones into his books as well. Those came about in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And I just thought I'd throw this one in for fun. If you've never read, anybody read John Brunner? He was very popular in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. In this book right here, Stand on Zanzibar, it is considered a classic. In 2010, the elected president's name was Obiami in his book. In his story, we elected President Obama. We eventually went to the moon. Next year is the 50th anniversary, believe it or not, of us going to the moon. I know we were all a lot younger when that happened initially. But a lot of science fiction books talked about that in the 40s, 50s, before going to the moon ever became reality. And if you look at some of the things that artists drew from the plot lines of the book, they had rovers, they had spaceships that were very similar to what eventually we created in our lunar module. Now, this is Hugo Gernsback. I mentioned him earlier, the father of science fiction. He actually created portable television. And this was a working device. This would have probably been in the 1940s, 1950s. He wrote this book. He wrote a lot of novels as well as editing magazines. And I actually bought this book, Ralph 124C for Everyone. It's a play on numerals and words. 124C, for the plus means everyone. And it is a novel that creates an amazing amount of things that actually came into being. And this book was written in the late 1920s, early 1930s. In it, he talks about television and channel surfing, the video phone, transcontinental air service, solar energy, sound movies. Remember, they were only silent movies then. Synthetic milk. You can go to the Walmart grocery store down here and buy synthetic milk. Artificial cloth, tape recorders, space flight. It was the first accurate description of radios, complete with a diagram that he put into the novel as well. And he is credited with coming up with the first mention of radar. And Arthur C. Clarke also recognizes this in his later books. Here's how Hugo Gernsback described radar. A pulsating polarized ether wave, if directed on a metal object, can be reflected in the same manner as a light ray is reflected from a bright surface. By manipulating the entire apparatus like a searchlight, waves would be sent over a large area. Sooner or later, these waves would strike a space flyer. A small part of the waves would strike the metal body of the flyer. These rays would be reflected back to the sending apparatus. From the intensity and elapsed time of the reflected impulses, the distances between the Earth and the flyer can then be accurately estimated. That in the late 1920s. In his book, Ralph 124C for Everyone. Hugo Gernsback also created the isolator. If you worked in a busy building and didn't want to interact with your fellow coworkers, you could put this on. And it came with oxygen, too. The idea of cubicles came along in the 1960s where you wouldn't have to interact with your fellow coworkers either. Gernsback published among his many magazines Radio News, and in this edition on the left, talked about being able to control radio without wires, the first remote control, and FaceTime over here, what we call FaceTime today, on television. All of these, I believe, in the 1920s. He was very inventive, very creative. So let's kind of look at some of the things we enjoyed today. This slide says, the computer once beat me at chess, but it was no match for me at kickboxing. If you'd like to see that in action, come use our state computer sometime. The first reference to things in the future that I can remember growing up was reading Dick Tracy. How many of you read Dick Tracy? Read it religiously on Sundays in the colored comic pages, cut out the Crime Stoppers tips in the upper right hand. I don't know what ever happened to those. I suspect that I didn't have baseball cards, but I have Mars Attacks cards that you could buy with the gum in them. And eventually, I think they got thrown away like many mothers threw away their kids' baseball cards. But Dick Tracy talked about the two-way wrist TV and two-way wrist radio. We have those today. You can wear them and talk. I know people who have Fitbits, and they can tell you how fast you're walking, how many miles you walked, how many calories you burned, all by this little device on your hand. Dick Tracy, when he started cutting back writing in the 1970s, he hired, that was Chester Gould who wrote that, he hired Max Allan Collins. Max Allan Collins is an award-winning and Edgar Award-winning mystery writer, if you've ever read him. Gould formed a friendship with Collins, and Collins, in the latter part of Gould's life, wrote Dick Tracy. And in this book where Collins collects what's called Dick Tracy's fiendish foes, he says that a Tracy tradition is to push science to near science fiction limits. And you can see that with the two-way wrist radio, telephone, and eventually the television as well. In Dick Tracy, he wrote about battery-powered cameras and well, I'm glad you saw that because there's a reference to this. I looked that up. The atomic light was basically to illuminate, to be able to see. If you dropped it in a cave, if you had bank robbers that came and robbed your bank at night and there were no lights. But in February of 1946, scientists actually started to study to see if they could use atomic light to treat children with infantile paralysis, which eventually became known as polio. Didn't work. But it was eventually perfected as use in banks for a deterrent to crime, and today we have infrared cameras. We've got them all over the museum here, too. And then television. I was watching a friend of mine the other night. Ted Cruz was speaking in Texas, and she was on Facebook Live, and you could watch him do the whole thing, just on this little cell phone device right here. That if you had an even smaller one, you could put it on your arm and you could watch it, just like in Dick Tracy. Dick Tracy also came up with the idea of the original video arraignment, which we have here in Otero County, and we've had for about 20 years. Up until then, if you were a criminal and you went to court, they hauled you down to the court, they put you in a lineup, you got picked out as a suspect, and Dick Tracy in the 1930s, he took it to the level of doing it by video. You can't talk about future technology without talking about Star Trek. And I can remember watching Star Trek when it was originally on television in, what was that, 1966, 67? I think what impressed me about it is characters actually got killed. That was the first memory I have. On most shows, everybody survived, not on Star Trek. Didn't occur to me till years later that everybody that died wore red shirts. The communicator, or the first flip phone, was used on Star Trek. Of course, you can see over here we have devices about the same size, which you can do many, many things on. Anybody here not have some type of cell phone? One person. Two? You know, I saw this very funny cartoon the other day that showed a bunch of kids going to the beach, and it said, this is how kids have tan lines today, and it showed their arms in a little square where the cell phone was where they'd been texting. How many been to the doctor lately and they get your vitals just by putting something up to your forehead? They know all about you. That was done in Star Trek in the mid-1960s medically with the tricorder there. And we have Google Glass today, and that was on a later version of Star Trek, one of the spin-offs. And this is just something that came out within the last couple of weeks. These are smart glasses, and they're being touted as smart glasses that don't make you look like a nerd. You get all kinds of information from here. The sunglass type glasses right there, you can see the bicyclist wearing in the upper right. That will give you a head-up display on how fast you are going, what your respiration is, what your heartbeat rate is, as you are either hiking, running, riding a bicycle. It tells you everything right in front of your eyes. And that's what they did many, many years ago on Star Trek. And they don't. They kind of fit the fashion style, and they don't make you look like a nerd. But you can see that they provide tons of information. You can watch videos on them. You can sign on to Facebook. You can go to YouTube, and you can see all this wearing these glasses. And nobody really knows what you're up to. 2001, this summer, we did a presentation on 2001 and talked, if you saw it, I know a lot of you are here, talked about the many, many things that 2001 predicted. The first iPads. This was in the 1960s. I took an airplane flight back in September, and nearly all of us had TV screens in front of us that we could watch movies, and you can't get away from commercials. We had to watch commercials as well if we were going to watch TV shows and movies. Commercial space. Commercial space has been a reality for some years. A spaceport here in New Mexico has not advanced as far, of course, as we had hoped it would advance by this time. But there are billionaires who pay the Soviets, the Russians, money to go up to the space station. And so commercial space is viable and probably will continue to be. And then a space station. Now, this space station right here was popular in a lot of Wernher von Braun paintings, drawings, but it also, Dave, you say it went back to the 1920s? We don't have that yet, but we do have space stations. This is where it gets really, really interesting. And this is where technology is going to affect each and every one of us, especially as we get older. This is from 1924. On the left, this is called the teledoctor. Everyone would have one of these in their homes. And you could put the device, as you see the young boy who's ill there in the bed, up to your heart, and it would tell the doctor everything that he would need to know about your vitals if you went to the doctor's office and they did the same type of tests. We don't have the teledoctor today. However, I have Presbyterian health insurance, and as part of my insurance package, you can schedule an appointment with a doctor on screen and talk to that doctor, talk about your symptoms. He or she can look at you, make sort of a rudimentary diagnosis, and give you a stopgap measure until you can actually get in the presence of a doctor who might be able to do more tests. That's something that I could go back down to my office and I could set up today. Is it with Blue Cross Blue Shield? Yep. So here's how, in the same time frame, it was predicted by Hugo Gernsback magazine, surgery could actually be done. You see on the right there, the doctor looking at the television screen with the nurse. He's looking at the patient, and here's how it works. The doctor's control of the apparatus there in his office. His image goes to a transmitting device to the patient at home. You've got some type of instruments there. It's called a teleautograph feeler. I don't know if I like that term or not. And then it transmits images of the patient as well as what the feeler comes up with in symptoms back to the doctor. That's called a teledactyl. I don't know where they came up with that name. But the doctor... Does it mean distant finger? Oh. I've lived in L.A. I've seen a lot of teledactyls go by when they're not happy with the way you drive. That was in the 1920s. Mid-1920s. Yeah, almost 100 years ago. So let's say 24, that's 6 years. That would have been 94 years ago. Let's fast forward ahead 30 years to the 1950s, and the technology, of course, in real life has gotten a little more, has gotten better. And this, in a Hugo Gernsback magazine, is how the writers and the artists believed that in the very near future, doctors could do surgery on patients. Has that come true? Oh, yeah. That's the Da Vinci surgical robot right there. And we didn't do it this past year at camp, but what, the year before we took them down to Memorial and... I know people who have undergone surgery. I know people who have undergone surgery with a device such as this, and other people who have undergone surgery by a doctor with hands-on. The recovery time with this, because it is so precise, is amazing versus recovery time for someone who's had an actual hands-on operation from a human being. Anybody ever see Fantastic Voyage? Some would argue the best part of that movie was Raquel Welch, but that's not a subject we're going to get into today. Fantastic Voyage, if you've not seen it, it's a fun movie. Well, I think Donald Pleasance was in that as well. Is about a miniaturized capsule with doctors on it. They put it in to try to take care of problems that are within the human body. You're looking, I think, at red blood cells right there in this special effects image. And this is something else that just a story that came out here about a week or two ago. Look at your fingernail and see how tiny that device is. That is called the Virob, V-I-R-O-B. It's a prototype. The Israelis have invented it. And they say they can put a camera on there. They can put medicine. If you have cancer, say, in an organ, and they want to take the cancer to a specific part of that body, they can do it with this. They can put shunts into blood vessels if you have medical issues with this device right here. Looks big on the screen, but if you look at your fingernail and how tiny it actually is, this prototype is being tested and developed, and probably is the next level in medical care and medical technology. It's just absolutely amazing. And that just talked about in the past couple weeks. So what's in the future? We've been trying to get one of those here for a couple of years. I don't know. What's in the future? Flying cars. Wouldn't you love to have a flying car? We had flying cars in the 50s and 60s. The science fiction writer Robert Sawyer says that he does not ever see flying cars, pardon the pun, taking off, because we can't keep from hitting ourselves on the ground. What makes you think we're going to be able to keep from hitting ourselves in the air? And it would be much more devastating. But yes, we did have flying cars. Here's an example right there. Bob Cummings Bob Cummings was an actor at a TV show called Love That Bob. He was an aviation enthusiast. He had a flying car, and that is him flying that car up in the upper right. This is the most recently developed technology of flying cars down here on the bottom. So it may be something that we don't see en masse, but the idea is not going to go away. And I would love to have one of those to come to work. Sometimes it's really interesting how we have technology and it goes away and then it's reinvented all over again. In the early 1900s, late 1800s, we had electric cars. And then the oil industry came along and sort of killed the electric car industry. But we had electric cars. Sports. Robotics and technology is taking over in sports as well. Now this is from, I believe, the 1930s. And they were testing technology for horse racing. This was done at the Cook County Fair near Chicago. If you've ever seen the Blues Brothers, you know where Cook County is. You know what killed that idea? Somebody take a wild guess. The jockey union. Jockey union said, you're going to put us out of business, and that killed that idea. Has the idea gone away? No. This, from the late 1920s, early 1930s, was a sketch of how a full-sized robotic jockey might eventually be in use. The Saudi Arabians are actually doing that today. That is from Saudi Arabia. They do, and that's not a human being, that is a robot. And these are small robots that the horse or the camel owners control from the sidelines, from their booth, wherever they happen to be set up when it comes to camel racing. This is a recent picture taking place over in Saudi Arabia. Well, what has not worked? Okay, who's going to admit they've used their cell phone in the restroom? Here are some things predicted that have not worked. In 1900, the Ladies' Home Journal said by the year 2000, our alphabet would not contain the letters C, X, and Q because they would be useless. They wouldn't be needed. Our words would be spelled like we sound them out. Yeah? Was it proposed? Really? Wow. But if you've ever seen teenagers text today, you know that's come true. Well, that's true, yes. In 1950, Popular Mechanics, no less. Every once in a while, I go to a thrift store, you find these old Popular Mechanics and Popular Science magazines. It's fun to see what they say, what they predict would be modern technology. But in 1950, Popular Mechanics said all of our food would be, we could go to the grocery store, we could buy frozen bricks wrapped in plastic. So if you wanted soup, you'd take out a frozen brick. You wanted steak, you'd take out a frozen brick. This article said, with the advent of frozen foods in the shape of bricks, cooking as an art is only a memory in the minds of old people. A few diehards will still broil a chicken or roast a leg of lamb, but experts will develop ways of deep freezing partially baked cuts of meat. Even soup and milk are delivered in the form of frozen bricks. And they went on to say you could cook a whole meal in 5 minutes. TV dinner, yep. Wrapped in plastic. 1950, 3D television would be, by the year 2000, it was predicted 3D television would be in every home, complete with smell-o-vision. 1952, a publication in Kentucky called the Kentucky New Era said that everybody would be participating in space flight. That hasn't happened. We would all be living in 1964. Isaac Asimov, no less, said by the 2014 World's Fair, first of all, there was not a 2014 World's Fair, said that we'd all be living underground and we would all have automated kitchens, cooking, I presume, brick food. This was, I think, the most interesting of the ones that have not come true. And this was in 1972. And what was first gaining popularity in 1972? The hippie movement. This publication in, the Oshkosh Daily Northwestern talked to futurists and did an article. And some of those futurists said that communal homes would be built in mass in large communities, and hippies would be living in those communal homes, and you wouldn't have to worry about individual homes, and it touted the communal showers that hippies would have as well. Fortunately, that has not come true. These things have not come true either, that the French predicted in 1900 would be popular in 2000. We do not have firefighters that can fly. We do not have underwater buses propelled by whales. We are not doing fish racing in the Pacific Ocean, you see down here on the bottom left. And I played croquet. It's hard enough to play above ground. Who would want to play croquet underwater? Trying to swing that club through water. And we don't have fully automated police running our streets. That has not come true either. That's a Hugo Gernsback magazine, and this was probably in the late 1920s, early 1930s. Although if you saw the movie RoboCop, you might wonder. We did find a story online the other day that several Walmarts in El Paso are testing a robotic employee that would go up and down the aisles and I think stock shelves and do things like that. But that's going to be tested here very soon in El Paso Walmarts. Is it? I think they do, yeah. They've been talking about robotic delivery by drones to your houses. I'm not so sure that I would like that. I mean, robocalls are bad enough. If you're going to call me, be a real person. So, that's our presentation this morning. You can look at everything we've had in the past that we thought would be around forever and is not. If you look at how technology has advanced just in the last 50 years, 40 years, when I was in high school, we had 8 tracks. And now you can buy those for like 20 cents a piece at the yard sale. But once again, it's up to kind of the writers and the folks who write scripts and the filmmakers to come up with what's going to be our future technology. The figure I read some years back is that what's being discussed, what's being written about, what's on the development table is 40 years in the future. I know someone who works for the military, and they told me that the F-117A Stealth Nighthawk fighter came about because the Soviets published a story in a magazine in the 1960s that said, here's the way this technology will work. And nobody took this scientist in the Soviet Union seriously. And an American engineer got his hands on a copy of it and read it in the 1960s and said, you know, we could do this. And 20 years later, we were flying the F-117A Nighthawk stealth fighter. And look at where the technology has come since then. So if you go back and you look at some of those things, cell phones in the 1920s, I can remember watching an Andy Griffith show where some guy came to town, his car broke down, and everybody was excited because he had a cell phone in his car. So somewhere between 20 and 40 years, as we get farther and farther into the future, that technology comes to market a little bit faster. But if you look at the evidence, some of the things that science fiction talked about over many, many years, we are reaping the benefits and enjoying the benefits up today. So I think you can accurately say that, yeah, those guys who have great imaginations were the first to create some of the things that we have in our homes now. Yes?
I don't know if it was Popular Science or Popular Mechanics. One of those two ran an article recently where they kind of made fun of themselves. They said, we first predicted the flying car 100 years ago, and we predicted one every 10 years since. We're always 10 years more.
I I would hate to stand in line at the MVD and get a registration for a flying car, because that's technology that is not improved. Yeah. Um, I know I've had some folks who've had prostate surgery and they're up and walking the same day. Uh, you have a thought on that? But I know folks too have gotten like hip replacements, knee joints, and within a couple of days, it's been done through the aid of robotic surgery within a couple of days. Good point. Any other comments, questions? Yeah. Yes, sir.
There's one science fiction writer, Hans Dominic, in Germany, and he wrote in the 1920s about something, a lot of predictions, what we experience now. And it describes in an island in the Pacific, there's a radiating object that keeps splitting. You cannot control it. Fukushima.
Oh.
And it got so bad, so he had one of the spacecraft that shot it up to the moon to get rid of it here.
Yeah.
He watched on the moon where it landed, and gradually it got redder and redder on the moon. But over here, it did not stop. It started spreading here on Earth. So they had to evacuate a lot of it to the planet Uranus for some reason.
Yeah. Wow. It'd be fun to find some of his stuff.
But the way the radiation is spreading, and still, they don't tell us about it, but it's still spreading.
Yeah.
Like in Yokosuka,
Hmm.
other places too.
Wow. I know, I guess my last comment would be that in about 1943 in New York, I think Ray Palmer was editing Amazing Stories at that time, and the FBI raided the offices. They came pounding on the door because they had published a story about the government creating an atomic bomb to end the war. And the government wanted to know who the leakage was. And Ray Palmer said, you know what? He just made that up. And he did. They had no idea that that project was actually going on. But once again, it's a writer with a creative imagination creates something. Usually the production follows afterward, but in this one instance, it just happened to coincide. I think so, yes. Yes. That would be nice. Especially as the population ages, and you have folks who have trouble getting out. That's one of the beneficial things of technology. Probably by the time you're out of college, that'll be reality.
Bring back the 1950s, real food.
Yeah, yes. Who's up next month? Kathy. Is he?
Yes, it's Chris. I think he's talking about Apollo 8.
Oh, yeah.
Houston, there is a Santa Claus, the Christmas mission of Apollo 8. Keep in mind if you know any veterans and their families, also first responders, museum will be open on Veterans Day, free to first responders, veterans, and their families. We have Science Saturday on November 10th, and that should be pretty exciting. Dave, what do you got going on for Science Saturday?
We are going to talk about Mars Insight mission. Mars Insights touches down towards the end of the month, and it is a seismology. We can put the measure flow out of Mars from a particular Mars quakes. So we'll have some hands-on activities related to that. Come and see us.
And also we'll be doing a live broadcast of the Insight landing in the theater, and that is November 26th. So if you have an opportunity to stop by and see that, what time is that landing, Dave?
I believe it's late morning, around 10:30, 11 o'clock.
And you'll get a press release about that if you've signed up for our email list of upcoming events. So if you put your email address on here, I'll add you to my list, and when we have something like that, you'll be one of the very first to know. So we invite you to attend all of these things, and certainly thank you for coming here today.
One way or another, you'll get on Kathy's list. I know I should. Thanks for coming.